All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Burnham, and I'm the Assistant Director here at the American Swedish Historical Museum. Thank you all so much for taking time this afternoon out of your day to join us for what promises to be a very fascinating talk today. I'm very excited. We're actually thrilled to bring you today's Third Thursday virtual lecture as part of our series that we had this year. I'm sure many of you know it is our centennial anniversary this year. We're celebrating 100 years of the museum, and this centennial lecture series is a way to engage with our audience all across the country, people both that are here, nearby and farther away. We want to keep everyone up to date with what's going on at the museum and provide learning opportunities throughout this whole celebration year. So thank you for joining in today. Today's talk will specifically explore the Swedish-American actress Greta Garbo and the development of her star persona. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. I ask that everyone please stay on mute so that way we can hear the full presentation without any background noises or interruptions. If you have a question, please feel free to type those questions in chat if you can't remember them for later, or you can hang on to it and we'll invite people to unmute and ask your questions live if you prefer to interact that way. We're happy to have you do that. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sankeerthna Vedamtam. Sankeerthna is the Programs and Education Coordinator at Bryn Mawr Film Institute. She received her MA in French from Bryn Mawr College. She is also a film writer and critic whose articles have appeared in publications including Philly-based magazine MovieJawn and Sense of Cinema. Thank you so much for joining, Sankeerthna. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and yeah, take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Thank you so much. I'm going to perform a tech miracle and manage to share my screen real quick. All right. I'm going to port over here. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for all so much for having me and for being here today. I'm really excited. Honestly, it's so hard to know where to begin because Greta Garbo, the figure, the actress, is one of the most fascinating figures and mysteries of Hollywood's golden age. People may recognize her as Madonna's first shout out in the bridge of her song Vogue. Others remember how she wanted to be alone. But her career itself is strangely waylaid outside her two best known sound films made in the late 1930s. It is thus worth, for me, I feel, asking the big questions of what made her famous in the first place, what made her an icon of the aloof woman who is capable of great passion. Garbo's name, as shorthand for this quality, has also been intrinsically tied to her Swedish heritage. As this lecture's title alludes, one of her chief publicity nicknames became the Swedish Sphinx, painting the portrait of a lady who traveled from a far off Nordic territory to be part of the Hollywood machine, who then excelled in and shunned it in equal measure. So today, I'm hoping to give you a primer on the craft that made Garbo popular and yet remains lesser known, the silent films that shot her to stardom. Karen Svensson, considered Garbo's definitive biographer, wrote that, quote, the telling of Greta Garbo's life story is largely dependent on what she would have considered the indiscretion of her friends and coworkers, unquote. That is to say, she spoke very little about her own likes and dislikes or her opinions on her art in public forums during her lifetime. So it's fallen to various writers on her legacy to draw from a plethora of secondary sources, including letters, studio records, diaries, and verbal recollections by those in her orbit to piece together the story of her early life, her nature, and her approach to her work. As a result, Garbo is really something of a prism. She reads differently based on where you're looking from. So there's multiple versions of her story, all of which are in their own way accurate and fascinating, and I hope through this lecture, enlightening. So, for this lecture today, I'm seeking to provide answers to three main questions about Garbo. The first really is, who was Greta Garbo before the cameras came to her, and how did she become a screen icon in this time and place? And then secondly, really, what was the image she showcased during the late 1920s as part of this very specific cross-section of the Hollywood silent film glamour machine? And finally, and I think the underpinning cement here is, why did she endure then in the public imagination, and why are we talking about her now? To think about why she lasts, it's necessary to travel all the way back to the beginning and discuss her roots in Sweden, which are critical to an understanding of not just her privately, but how her Swedishness played an indispensable role in her Hollywood image creation. She was born Greta Lofisa Gustafsson in 1905 in the Södermalm district and neighborhood of Stockholm, Sweden. She came from a long lineage of working-class peasant farmers from the South who were affected deeply by the Industrial Revolution and had moved to the city in hopes of a better life. She grew up in steep poverty in the 1910s with her parents and two siblings, and really this life was exacerbated by many workforce and labor conflicts that were sweeping the country at the turn of the century. As a result, she enjoyed role-playing with childhood friends as a very classic form of escapism, and she adored, in particular, the early Nickelodeon 5-minute short films, as well as live theater. Sweden actually had a culture of respect for acting, and actors were a very well-regarded form of celebrity. So her parents knew that they could find young Greta standing outside the theater district for hours on end to see actors come and go from the theater. Soon, however, because of the Spanish flu's devastating effect on the family health and finances, she had to go to work at the age of 14, and that's how old she is in this picture here, in this still here. She started working at 14, first in a barber shop where she lathered men's faces before they got their shaves, and then as her father's unofficial caregiver before his untimely early passing in 1920. She then worked her way up to such jobs as a shopping catalog model, which then led to work as an extra in various Swedish films, including ad campaigns and larger studio productions featuring such actors as Gösta Ekman Sr., who you can see here right on the right in his bow tie, who is a legendary pioneering Swedish stage and film actor. She then received a scholarship for a 2-year program at Sweden's Royal Dramatic Training Academy and was near the completion of her training in 1924. In the meantime, just along the river bend in Stockholm in 1924, Moritz Stiller was preparing an adaptation of his finest film yet, a romantic, tragic comic epic to be called Gösta Berling's Saga. Stiller, though, was no ordinary director for hire. He was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants who had settled in Sweden, and he was openly queer and a proud pioneer. He had established himself as the preeminent filmmaker of stylish prestige pictures and epics during the Swedish film industry's golden age of silence, which are often boundary-pushing, including Vingarn, which is one of the earliest extant gay romance films, as well as Eroticon, which is a very sexually liberated comedy of manners. His next step was Gösta Berling, which would tell the lavish, melodramatic story of the titular character, an alcoholic priest who gets defrocked and has to claw his way back to love and fortune over the course of 3 hours. It was based on a popular novel of the same name, and the process of bringing it to the screen was nationally anticipated, similar to the frenzy that Gone with the Wind would create here in the US a decade later. And much like Clark Gable's Rhett Butler, Swedish national idol Lars Hansen was the public and Stiller's only choice for the title role of Gösta. But for the leading female role of the love interest, Stiller was seeking a fresh face, someone new. Greta Gustafsson, by now experienced through all her bit parts and work as an extra, was called in to audition for him. Seeing the results, Stiller became sure that this was the one. This was the girl who could carry the picture alongside Lars Hansen. He put his reputation on the line with the studio executives and vouched for her ability to carry the performance he required. He also vouched, most importantly, for his ability to create a new star in the process with a persona to match. And you can see her right here and is still on the left. And so, naturally, the next step in molding his new creation would be to change her name. As per Swedish naming conventions, Gustafsson was a very standard last name. Plenty of people had some variation of it. You know, Greta was all right. Greta's a great first name, but there had to be a sort of sense of matching syllables, a name that could roll off the tongue. And so Gustafsson was out. Stiller's latest discovery would become Greta Garbo, and that's how she was billed right here on her very first film poster. You know, stepping away from Sweden for a moment, it's really important to keep in mind that the film industry of the 1920s was truly international, since the intertitles, the title cards that played in between visuals of silent films, since those could be, simply translated in the local language wherever a film was distributed in other countries, stars could truly be known the world over. And nowhere was this more evident than in America, the nascent and fast-growing Hollywood, which was not yet the juggernaut tastemaker of pop culture that we typically think of during the Golden Age. Particularly in the mid-20s, it was continental Europe at the top, whether it was Germany pioneering expressionist visual style at their flagship studio in Berlin, or Sweden, as we've just discussed, and their dreamy social realism. The continent was the geographic center of film innovation. So the studio brass at the newly formed American studio, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, fronted by the Titan Louis B. Mayer, seen here with his glasses, was always on the lookout for quote-unquote exotic foreign imports to the American industry, including, up to that point, several of Garbo's fellow country folk, such as director and actor Victor Seastrom, who's seen here on the right several generations later alongside Ingmar Bergman, and popular matinee star Anna Q. Nilsson, seen here on the left. This was also actually part of a divide and conquer strategy, poaching European talent to America to ensure Hollywood's creative and financial dominance and control over international distributors. So MGM was really hunting for this kind of continental European talent, and Stiller was a huge name at that point. While stories conflict, one version chiefly discusses how Mayer met with Stiller in Berlin and agreed to give him and his new discovery American contracts. The newly christened Garbo trusted the career moves of her mentor Stiller wholeheartedly, stating, "Whatever Mr. Stiller said, I knew was always the best thing to do." Their relationship was complex and deeply intimate, and many assumed they were sleeping together in the already established model of the director and his actress muse. The truth was vastly more complicated, though. It's clear that he impressed an emotional codependency on her towards him, even shaping her values on placing art above all other relationships, while he himself seemed ambivalent about her. Whatever the private case may have been, professionally, he took her with him to America, and this is them after the 10-day crossing from Stockholm to New York on the ocean liner. And so when the duo arrived first in New York and then took another cross-country trip to Los Angeles, Stiller, unfortunately, was almost immediately troubled by severe language barrier problems, differences in working methods, and backdoor studio politics with the draconian Louis B. Mayer, while Garbo was kind of in the lurch, waiting on promised work and really caught in a web of uncertainty beyond her control. Finally, however, MGM found two important projects with which they introduced her on-screen image, Torrent and The Temptress, both from 1926. Garbo's own Swedish quote-unquote exoticism was already a publicity talking point, and the question was how this specific allure that projected a general sense of acceptable otherness could be used to sell the movie product. The eventual answer was found by translocating her exoticism to the foreign story settings of Spain and Argentina in The Torrent and Temptress, respectively, with Paris, France as an additional cultural shorthand in both films for gaining infamy and glamour. You can see some of those visual markers of exoticism through the fan that she's holding on the left, and her depicted as having this flower bouquet near her hair on the right. And in both films, she played mysterious, out of place women who enter communities and tempt the respectable men within these preset boundaries. These characters would inevitably pay the price for these indiscretions by transforming into a tragic fallen woman by the last act, mourning her lost innocence. Seeing a different, recognizably international face act these roles was part of her allure, and she became the face of the tragic siren who must always pay for her sins, but really sure looks like she's having a good time committing them. And in Torrent, she met cinematographer William Daniels, who added a further visual dimension to this allure when he introduced her soft look and a focus on her eyes that registered strongly on screen and even comes through in these two stills here, in my opinion, making the viewing audience feel that she was inhabiting their long hidden desires and temptations. Garbo and Torrent were a huge hit, and then the Temptress immediately proved she wasn't a one-off, although it was hard going, because initially Stiller was assigned to direct the Temptress, and mentor and mentee were delighted to be reunited. But he simply could not work within the American studio system with its various budgetary restrictions and insistence on shooting specific scenes at specific times and dates, instead of Stiller's and really an overall European method of playing around with footage until he had gotten what he wanted. What's more, the language barrier remained a problem for him when he was the one having to give all the instructions. Garbo had begun receiving English tutelage as part of the MGM tradition of grooming their star stable with etiquette and lessons. Stiller, however, had had to rely on various Swedish colleagues to translate, and Garbo was, from her position on the other side of the camera, unable to help him. Moreover, during a long, exhausting scene of a shoot of a carnival scene, a telegram was actually delivered to Garbo on set with the news that her beloved younger sister had suddenly passed away. Yet there was no question of going back to Sweden, not when there was a film to complete on budget. Garbo had no leverage with the studio yet, and so she had to stay. Meanwhile, MGM had had several previous tangles with temperamental European directors, leading to a zero-tolerance, xenophobic attitude towards Stiller. They chose star over director. Stiller was fired and replaced, and Garbo was forced to finish the film without him and without a break. A grossed $200,000 more than Torrent, confirming her own place as a star in waiting without the all-consuming guidance of her mentor. After these stepping stones, her third film, Flesh and the Devil, introduced the most important element of Garbo's screen image, her ability to feel both extremes of the relationship spectrum at once. The plot arcs of her character were bound by the required morality of late 20s silent film, where a sexually active woman was usually obliged to pay for her pleasure by ending up alone, destitute, or both by the last frame. But Garbo was perceived as bringing a sense of believable desire and emotional investment to this character mold that allowed her roles to be seen as real people instead of simple, warning signs on how not to behave. As Karen Svensson says, she was an actress who could effectively portray carnal desire, yet place it on a spiritual level that defied most censorship. And Flesh and the Devil was the first time this contradictory quality had the chance to blossom. Flesh and the Devil tells a quite simple story of tragedy, how two army friends are ensnared and eventually entangled within the passions of a mysterious, sensual woman, and you can guess that's Garbo. There's a lot to be said about the relationships in this film, but for Garbo, this film made her an international icon. She was paired alongside Lars Hansen, previously her Gosta Berling, and then for the first time, a handsome matinee idol named John Gilbert. And that's who you see in all three of these pictures. Gilbert was a respected actor at the time, and when they met, by all accounts, it was something like love at first sight. He became one of the great stormy loves of her life. This development transformed Flesh and the Devil for Garbo, who'd been extremely reluctant to take the project on. She didn't want to be a vamp again and had been threatened again with breach of contract to make her stay. But as filming proceeded and she acted alongside Gilbert, becoming more comfortable with him, it became clear that he was a co-star who could bring out her best qualities and sensitive acting choices, providing a convincing figure of passion to match her. The result of this atmosphere still stands as one of her best films, and audiences certainly agreed. And this is them at the premiere of Flesh and the Devil, a rare candid photo of Garbo. The next step was silent superstardom, and her meteoric rise was really intrinsically intertwined with the art of silent film as a whole. To quote writer Anne Helen Peterson, the demands on stars were completely different during this era, because without sound, the eyes and face had to tell what even the best subtitles could not. Stars had visual archetypes to inhabit, and in her case, tropes of tragic, doomed love stories to play out. Garbo was uniquely positioned to excel in this medium due to those 2 years of dramatic theater training she had undergone, which she then married with the pantomime technique of silent film. As Svensson describes, the acting technique at the drama school stressed simplicity in motion, feeling, intellect, experience, and physical characterization, the mechanics of which were drilled into each student until they became part of his or her subconscious. This physical method of gestures and movements served Garbo well for her silent acting technique in a series of dramatic silent romances. You can see here there's Love, very self-explanatory, and then here next to it, La Belle Ténébreuse, which is a French poster for her film The Mysterious Lady, and naturally A Woman of Affairs really placed her character front and center, marking to audiences that she is the titular woman. She is the titular mysterious lady. And then finally, a title like The Single Standard. This was a play on the double standard. And so the film implies that there's going to be a leveling of the sexual liberation playing field by applying everyone to a single standard. And as you can see, these titles really conveyed her status as a woman of the world, apt to get entangled with relationships she knows are against societal rules, but also almost always becoming a fallen woman in the second half as a result, who then suffers nobly and tragically. To elaborate a little bit further on this was still before the official adoption of the Puritan Motion Picture Production Code in the 1930s, but there was still a general crackdown on subject matter and open depictions of sexuality due to several scandals that had happened earlier in the 1920s. There was also MGM's general tight grip over their films, preferring their own sense of judgment, script, and budget control over the well-being and artistic development of their actors and actresses. So as a result, Garbo became a rarity in that as she started making one film after another, she knew what kind of material she could perform in best and often demanded the crew and co-actors needed to make them a reality. She made so much money for MGM, was such an object of mystique, that she could get away with this creative control throughout the often haphazard development of her film projects. And some milestones of this nature include Love, which was actually an Anna Karenina adaptation where the original cast and crew were scrapped except for Garbo, and she was instead reteamed with John Gilbert. And it was here that she started demanding the unique requirements for which she's later become infamous. But what her demands showed, was her uncanny knowledge of the camera. She would not shoot close ups during her time of the month, for example, because she knew it would not match continuity. Her particular breakouts and bouts of sweating, for example, would cause her face to look paler and washed out compared to the other 3 weeks of the month. And so she started displaying this finely tuned awareness of how to best present herself. She also started requesting to be surrounded by black flats, which are basically pieces of black cardboard paper that had to be manually held up. They're usually used for creating lighting effects, but she asked these to be held up when performing so she could perform erotic, passionate sexual scenes in relative solitude, in an extremely early precursor to today's policies of intimacy coordinators and choreographing that kind of action. She also started making sure that she could personally get along with the director, that he could work with her needs and demands. And so in the case of Love, she was comfortable with British director Edmund Goulding as a fellow European who understood why she had particular working methods. Another milestone film during this time was A Woman of Affairs. As I've mentioned before, Garbo played essentially almost every foreign nationality the studio could throw at her, from Spanish to Russian. So she wanted to play an English-speaking modern-day woman, and so she decided that she wanted to play the lead in an adaptation of this best-selling novel of the era titled The Green Hat. This was a literary chronicle of the English upper classes about a free-spirited woman who keeps encountering essentially male disappointments. The book contains frank revelations about syphilis, drug use, and queerness, which in 1928 America, again, could not be portrayed openly on screen under the hovering scissors of the censors. So title and character names had to be changed. A secret involving the underworld had to be changed to one about a singular individual criminal past, which makes the story as presented look a lot like Much Ado About Nothing when you watch it. But it remains a personal favorite of mine and was a huge success at the time because the real draw became Garbo's spectacularly lit face and eyes, which are incredibly expressive in this film, alongside, once again, John Gilbert in their third film together. And then finally, by 1929, Garbo could not be kept away from exotic, amorous adventures for long. And so if she had to play an English speaking, quote unquote, ordinary woman, then the elements of her usual older man, younger man love triangle formula would have to be punched up. So, taking advantage of the South Seas film adventure craze that was happening at the time, came about Wild Orchids, a tale of a devoted young wife who travels to Indonesia and loses her heart to a Javanese prince, played in yellowface by a fellow exoticized Swedish actor, Nils Astor. This is, I'll say, it's a pretty darn uncomfortable film to watch, but it does show quite well how Orientalist exoticism was a strong key factor in Garbo's exotic, mysterious allure, how an association with the other made her an appealing image of romantic escapism to audiences. However, tragedy repeated backstage just as it had on the Temptress 2 years prior. Yet again, a telegram was delivered to Garbo on set, this time to tell her that her mentor, Marit Stiller, long since returned to Sweden, was dead. It was yet another blow for her, as she still hadn't gone back to her home country since starting her American movie career. So once more, it was a struggle to get through production, and she never quite forgave MGM for their workhorse treatment of her during these early years. This was another reason that she became determined. They would make films her way or not at all. And so these are these accumulated circumstances are in large part that when you go back and look through the breadth of her silent film work, these star-making films, they turn out to be this incredibly interesting combination. They're quite intense, quite formulaic, but also entertaining and melodramatic in ways that play to Garbo's increasingly pointed strengths. There's always several signature cathartic scenes that recur, such as a declaration of forbidden love, a scene of resistance before she gives in to her desires, or a scene of bitter regret over the past, her world-weary, noble suffering always expressed with really multiple close-ups of her luminous eyes. She shows female sadness and existential loneliness in these films in ways that I find are all too uncommon today, and certainly that female audiences in the late 1920s flocked to in record numbers, feeling their own emotions displayed on her silent, expressive face. By late 1929, however, the situation was quite different. It had totally metamorphosed. Sound had come, and with it, so many of Garbo's fellow expatriates suddenly found themselves shunned in America on account of their perceived thick accents. The aforementioned Anna Q. Nilsson saw her career take a deep spiral, while Lars Hansen promptly went back to Sweden to enjoy a long, illustrious sound career in his native language. In Garbo's case, though, she had already been lined up to do her first Hollywood talkie. Her accent had been deemed pleasing, acceptable, something that MGM could take a chance on. And so while they were preparing her first talkie, they took the opportunity to give her a stylish, silent send-off. It was truly the end of an era because Garbo's last silent film turned out to be Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's last silent film overall, and bringing together Garbo's preferred European crew and several of her story staples, including Social Scandal and Murder. This film marked several lasts for Garbo and her professional image in this time. It was the last time Garbo would act in her established routine with the flats hiding her wordless face to all but the camera, and the last time, for example, that she would also have a live mood orchestra on set to guide her through her intimate scenes. The film, as you can see, was fittingly named The Kiss, and it was named after the landmark 1896 short film that shocked the public by showing a couple in the act. And with Garbo's now signature combo of sex and pathos, it was a monster hit, even more significant considering it came out in November 1929, right after the stock market crash. When sound pictures dawned, Garbo would have to do it all over again and forge her path in the new medium over the next decade. And she managed to do it quite successfully too, with the power of her charisma and a remarkable sound-friendly voice. But that is a story for another day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sankeerthna. That was amazing. That was a really in-depth look at her early career and how she got to be the star that she became. A lot of new information I didn't know. Hopefully that was new to a lot of people as well. Lots of thumbs up, lots of applause for you. Amazing. So let's go ahead and open it up. I don't see any questions currently in chat, but if you would like to type a question or if you'd like to unmute and ask a question, I'm sure Sankeerthna would love to answer. Okay. Great. Give people a few minutes here.
I had a question for you. The content of her film seems incredibly shocking for the era, but I don't know what was going on. When did films get more conservative in the American context? You probably have a better sense of the overall ups and downs of that.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. In the 1920s itself, there were several ups and downs. Garbo's came at a time when they were they had just undergone, the industry itself had undergone several huge scandals of like stars that had like drug overdoses. There were several who had prominent legal problems. And so Garbos were in the middle of that flux where they were trying to appease censors prematurely, but still slipping in that content. And so that's why her films are still incredibly shocking for the time. And then so when films became more conservative is, I would say, right after that, when the production code was established, because just to give like the 2-second explanation, the production code came around in 1930. This is the precursor to our current rating system. It was established in 1930, right after her last silent came out in context of her career. And there was still like 4 years of like kind of non-enforcement where studios were still sort of flouting the rules and showing more frank content. And then 1934, I would say, when they finally made like essentially the censor board and the motion picture administration to really start hammering down, I would say kind of 1934 and beyond is really when in the American context, films became more conservative and would essentially be in that under this sort of watchful eye for about 3 decades afterwards. Yeah.
Great. I have a really quick question, and then I see we have some in chat as well. I know that you just recently, we partnered with the Bryn Mawr Film Institute to show the Queen Christina film, and which was one of hers as well. Can you talk a little bit about what that meant to her to play a strong female monarch from her own country, and kind of how did that picture come about?
Yeah, so as I said, she was really unhappy with MGM as a result of all they had been kind of molding and sculpting her through during this initial part of her contract. And so the contract that started with the silent films I discussed here ended in 1932. And so Garbo finally went to Sweden after that and had the chance to go back home at that point. And at that point, she had also become friends with a lot of the screenwriters. In particular, one of her closest friends was the screenwriter Sarka Virtiel. I'm pronouncing that wrong, but who had started at MGM in 1930 itself, at the start of the decade. And so she really wanted to make a passion project. She really wanted to have her own base ground material to create a project. And when she went back home to Sweden, she started, among other things, kind of visiting, for example, Queen Christina's palace in Uppsala in Sweden, and finding inspiration just by being back home. And so in terms of Queen Christina, which she had made about 3 or 4 sound films up until that point as part of her original contract, it ended. And then she really had the chance for once to go spend some time in her home country, go back to the drawing board and come up with a project that she genuinely wanted to do, because they were willing to pay through the nose for her. She received $300,000 for Queen Christina. Like they were willing to pay for her to come back with a new and improved contract. And then so that was how the film Queen Christina entered its germination and was made. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
So it was very personal to her. It was something that she really felt she had helped make from the ground up. Yeah, as a result of taking back and investing in more creative control on her end. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's so specific to Sweden and to history, and something I thought she would be really passionate about. So, all right, and our questions from the chat. In terms of their careers, who would you say was the more successful actor, Greta Garbo or Ingrid Bergman? In what ways were their acting styles different and informed by the period?
Oh, that's a great question. I hesitate in terms of like success, because Garbo herself chose not to return to acting or make a comeback after she left Hollywood forever in 1941, because she was extremely successful she only made 28 films, which is incredible to think about. It was actually quite a short career film-wise. Whereas Ingrid Bergman, she started acting in the 30s in Sweden. She has a quite extensive Swedish filmography, reinvented herself when she came to America, and then reinvented herself again when she went to Europe, and then reinvented herself one more time when she came back to America. And this was over the span of like 5 or 6 decades. And so I think they were both successful in their own right. I would say Garbo was successful in that she really embodied a specific time period and crystallized that. And Bergman was successful because she really proved a versatility. She was always an international actress. She acted in, I believe, let's see, off the top of my head, 4 languages or so over the course of her career. And so she really showcased her own brand of kind of multilingual international success. I would say perhaps building on Swedish actors that had come before her, because Bergman had a very noticeable accent too, but she went on to be able to be the path breaker and an international film actress in a way that perhaps previous multilingual actresses like Garbo had not been able to achieve. And so perhaps that answers for the success portion. And I think their acting styles were definitely totally different and influenced by their different time periods, because Bergman had at that point a generation of Swedish film to look at. Gösta Ekman, who I mentioned before, was actually one of her icons, and she acted with him in a romance. And so she had this kind of naturalistic observational sense that had come from watching films when they started to be widely distributed. And Sweden was a juggernaut of that in the 1920s. And so Bergman's style was really informed by her watching films. Garbo's was influenced by watching theater. And so she took some of that staginess. And also Bergman started her career in the sound era. And so she was always within that thing that was always a given for her, whereas Garbo had to really master the pantomime of silent film as well. So that's also another thing that were informed by their respective time periods.
Excellent points. Thank you. Speaking of her silent film work, Linda would like to know, what is a good source of her silent films? Like, where can you find that?
Yeah, I'll say actually YouTube, because her silent films are mostly from the late 20s. Most of the copyrights most of them are in the public domain, and so they're widely available for viewing. They're in really good quality on YouTube. Well, most of them have been uploaded on public sites on YouTube in various like 4K links. I would say the one exception to that is Gösta Berling's saga, which has a great print on YouTube, but does not have subtitles. It only has the Swedish title card. So if you speak Swedish, though, good for you. And I hope that that does prove enjoyable. But yes, no, YouTube, her films are really widely available all over the internet because they've exceeded the copyright. So that's actually a nice relief in terms of her silent work. Most of it's been preserved. She only has one silent film that is lost.
And if you are a big Garbo fan and you would like to learn Swedish in order to watch that film, we do offer language classes starting this fall. So put that little plug out there. All right. So our next question comes in here from JM. Why do you think Madonna looked to Garbo as inspiration? I'm not sure if you have any insight into that.
Yeah, I don't have perhaps like direct quotable insight from that, but I think my suspicion would be the enigmatic side of Garbo and her wishes to kind of be kept away from the madding crowd, as it were, might have provided a huge inspiration to Madonna, who always was very vocal about the fact that she took inspiration from, for example, like the famous blondes of the era, including Garbo's greatest rival, Marlene Dietrich, who was much more outspoken, extroverted, and willing to engage with public image creation, whereas Garbo really sort of shunned that outside of her film. She was Dietrich, I'll say, in my opinion, was always a really great performance artist and master of her publicity image and feeding into it, whereas Garbo fed into it by shunning it, ended up feeding into her own enigmatic image by really wanting to be away from it all. And so I think for Madonna, I think perhaps the attraction of Garbo to her was that if Marlene Dietrich represented the performance art and was an inspiration in that public embracing performance artist side, Garbo really encapsulated the privacy and wish to have something to keep for themselves that so many celebrities struggle with, that sort of dichotomy. So I would suspect that Garbo held that attraction of someone who really cut themselves off and was not, after a certain point, was not willing to engage with that, the circus that comes with celebrity too.
Great. I think we'll, since we're on this topic, jump to a further down question and come back to the earlier ones. But were Dietrich and Garbo personal rivals, or was this largely manufactured by the studios? Do you have any insights as to their personal connection and how they felt about each other, from Alexander?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I am afraid I can't provide too much insight into how they felt about each other. I know Dietrich had certainly professional respect for Garbo, who had really started it. But in terms of the rivalry, it was really manufactured by their studios, because MGM had Garbo since the 1920s. Dietrich came to Paramount in 1930, I believe it's 1931 or 1932. And so she was explicitly marketed as the German Garbo, or like if Garbo was like from Sweden, Dietrich was from Germany. And so just as, for example, their two industries had this professional rivalry in the 20s in continental Europe, now it was a kind of extrapolation of that in like the different continental European stars. This was a really important part of the publicity campaign, and so and it served to generate interest for both of them in the end, actually. And so definitely in very much manufactured and played up by the studios. It's funny, one of her sound films called As You Desire Me feature, there's an amnesia subplot, there's a lot going on, but when we first meet Garbo, she is performing in a cabaret with a thick German accent and has a blonde dye. And so that was actually a specific parody tribute to Marlene Dietrich that shows up in the sound era too. And so there was this tongue-in-cheek awareness from both parties of this sort of back and forth that was being made up. And so it was definitely like really intertwined with that studio publicity machine, I'll say. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, moving on, we have two more questions to go through. How would you, Lisa asks, how would you compare, contrast the two versions of Anna Karenina? Her two versions.
I would say Love, the silent version, is way more bare bones. It really chops it down to Anna, Vronsky, and Karenin, like the love triangle. And it also, it's really strange, but it's really strange in that it's really one of the films that is responsible for cementing Anna Karenina as like a big tragic love story in the Western imagination, since it was one of the earliest film adaptations. And so it really is kind of a bare bones adaptation in a way. It's not that long. It's only about 80 to 90 minutes. And there were even two separate endings that were shot. One was not to spoil Anna Karenina for anyone, I'm sorry.
It's been out for a while. If it's anybody's fault if they haven't seen it.
But there's they actually had to shoot two endings, one which complies with the novel, if you know how the novel ends, and one that is a very happy, they reunite at the end. And because people wanted to see a happy love story. The sound version, on the other hand, goes full throttle tragedy, and is also way more lavish in terms of costuming. It was a huge hit in Europe, which most of Garbo's sound films would be bigger hits in Europe than America, because it was really, it where love is very bare bones, like let's focus on the passion, let's focus on the character relationships. Anna Karenina is the sound version is much more like interested in creating this like exquisite like production design and costuming and kind of sumptuous atmosphere, and feels a lot more like a historical, a very anachronistic, you'll, as anyone who watches it can tell, but it's much more interested in doing that Russian historical setting in the technical aspects.
Great. All right, so I think our last question is going to go back to a little bit involving her early childhood. So was she involved in philanthropy again due to that poverty she experienced as in her early life?
I am not sure. I cannot remember at this moment, but I do know that when after she kind of retired from Hollywood, she lived in New York for many years, and to my knowledge, and this will be something to either double check or have to look up later, but I do recall that she was a very wealthy woman because she had made investments and such. She was an art collector, things like that. And if I believe that there was some aspect of her being involved in that, but that will be definitely something to double check. I know for a fact that it was something that stayed with her even after she left Hollywood, like after she really just kind of lived as a socialite and person and just regular person in New York, that it is something that stayed with her. But I'm unfortunately
That's okay.
not able to give more. Yeah, but
Yeah,
thank you. That is a good question, though.
yeah, you have provided us such an in-depth knowledge of this persona that I think we've all really felt like we've gotten to know her a lot. Um, Thank you so much for everything, Sankeerthna. And I would really like to, if you are interested in this topic, I'm actually going to kick it over to our curator, Brett Peters, for a second, and he can mention how this topic ties in with our current exhibition, From Taste to Tech.
Yeah, hey everyone. Our Taste the Tech exhibition is on view until February 7th, 2027, so you still got a little bit of time left to come and check it out. We do talk about cinema throughout the last 100 years of Nordic impact on the US. We talk about everybody from Greta Garbo, of course, to Ingrid Bergman, to Ingmar Bergman and his collaborators, to Dolph Lundgren, so on and so forth. But we actually do have a really remarkable pair of dress sandals owned and worn by Greta Garbo, made for her by the Brooks brothers. So I encourage you to come and check it out. It's a really cool exhibition.
Great. Thank you so much, Brett. And thank you, Sankeerthna. This has really just been extra special, and we really appreciate your time in putting it together. Thank you all for joining us today on this wonderful Thursday. Again, we do this program every third Thursday of the month, so please check in back with us for next month's topic. And if you're interested in supporting the museum, especially during our centennial year, please feel free to reach out to us directly, if that's through membership or through donation or through volunteerism, anything like that. We're happy to get you involved in our community. So thank you again, everyone, and we will see you next month.